Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I'm going to talk about the rise of Standard English during the Middle English period. I hope by the end of this session, you would understand how and why a Standard English was developed during Middle English period, especially towards the second half of the Middle English period. Well, my dear students, a variety of local dialects led to a standard written language towards the end of the 14th century. And when we look at the history of the 15th century, we realize that this standard language won a general recognition. In fact, from there onwards till to date, we find both in speech and writing that standard form is being used. Of course, it has developed with the passage of time. Of course, there have been some changes, but mainly that standard that was developed at that time and was recognized has been retained. Well, my dear students, when we go back and trace the history of this process of standardization, we realize a few factors. East Midland District contributed the most to the formation of a standard English language. In fact, it was the English that was being used, the dialect that was being used in East Midland that mainly became the basis of the dialect of London later on, which was developed later on as a standard. Now the question is, what were the causes? What were the reasons for the establishment of a standard language? Well, I would talk about a few of the causes. The first, and I would say very important cause, is the diversity that we had in England in terms of regions. When we look at the region from where we had this dialect impacting the London choice of language, we notice this was a region that was occupied a middle position, that was occupying a position that was in the center, in fact, and thus it was neither at one end nor at the other end of the extremes of north or south. So, when a region is in the center, automatically it has an advantage over the areas that would be on the sides or that would be on the boundaries of the kingdom or of the area. Then, of course, this being in the center had influences from all the other dialects, had influences from all the other regions streaming to it, contributing towards its formation. Naturally, this was less conservative as well. Also, interestingly, it was less conservative than the southern dialect. All right, it was less conservative than the southern dialect, but simultaneously, it was less radical than the northern part of it. So, it was more like a balanced or more like an area that would, bring the differences in, strand them in, and, make them acceptable for all. Of course, all these effects had effect on the language. So, in the dialect there, the sounds and inflections, they represented a kind of a compromise between the north and the south that were two extremes. Secondly, the second example that I'm going to talk about is, that caused all this standardization to happen. When we notice the East Midland language, we notice that the East Midland district was, in terms of size, it was the biggest one. It was the largest one. The natural result was not only it was the largest in size in terms of geography, it also had the maximum of the population. The most of the population of England belonged to this particular district. The land was more valuable than the hilly country to the north and west. All right, not only it was big in size, but also the quality of the land. The geographical conditions were far, far better than north and west. It was not a hilly land. So, because at that time, agriculture was one of the major sources. So, this land was an advantage. Now, because the age was of agriculture, this advantage that the land was good, this led towards the prosperity of people. This also led towards, more people coming to this area and living there. And as my dear students, you know that any language is what its culture is, what its people are. The people who speak a particular language, the people who use a particular language, the way they are, the kind of people they are, it has a strong impact on the language that they have. And, because this was the area where people were most prosperous, maximum in number, had better living conditions, all these things led towards, making the language of this part as the language of London, which became the standard language from Middle ages onwards for English language. Even today, we find that the same standard language is retained.